I want to pick up on a point that was made by a number of you, this linkage to justice and rights, because I think it is probably one of the most important building blocks on which we need to concentrate in the coming years. Justice is something that we can interpret as intrinsic, as being part of a fair society, of a social contract, but in our society today we transact justice also, at least the right of recourse, through our courts, through the justice system, through the judiciary. And I just want to draw your attention to a congress that we invited to here together with the Brazilian partners, including the Supreme Court or State Tribunal, I think it is called, of the state of Rio de Janeiro, where we invited Chief Justices, Attorneys General, Prosecutors General and Auditors General to a conference here this week to discuss with them the relationship between the Sustainable Development Agenda and the judicial process. And it is a fascinating debate, because if we want to talk about rights, it is not just a matter of declaratory discourse, it is also then accepting that you have a right to recourse, you have a right to seek justice, you have a right to look somewhere in your society for an authority that can ensure that these rights are upheld. And it's a fascinating discussion, because the response to this Congress overwhelmed us. Well over 200 of them came because the sustainability, the environmental conflicts, the linkage in social and environmental rights is pushing through the front doors of courts all across the world, including here in Brazil as well. India, and many development projects end up in the courts in India. It's an interesting phenomenon of a society trying to find a resolution to irreconcilable interests, let's put it that way. I think we need to focus a lot more on the judicial system, or the judiciary, alongside the executive and the legislative. And this is also true for the intergenerational contract, because one of the great risks of a democracy is that it plays to the interests of the majority, and in an intergenerational context it doesn't take much mathematical imagination who is going to win, the present against the future. And I think it is important that the courts become part of the system of protecting the rights of those who are not even born yet. And this is particularly true when it comes to sustainability, sustainable development and the environment. On the comment about global citizen movements, absolutely. I think we also saw here in Rio a certain disarray in the global social movements. There are movements with very particular realities. The realities of South America, of the indigenous peoples here, of the land rights movement. These are very immediate, very direct, very alive problems, preoccupations, which have led many people to have a disengagement from the political system, in a sense, or a loss of trust and faith. But these are not the problems of, let's say, civil society in other parts of the world, maybe in Asia or in Europe or the United States or even Africa. I think secondly, we also have a moment where the global citizens movement is in search of an agenda that can also bind together these very different realities. And, you know, for me it is not a matter of finding one conversation. It would be a madness to search that in our diverse world, but I think we see a lot of critique here. But I think civil society also has the ability to put many more alternatives forward. It is not a lack of capacity, it is perhaps a lack of a coherent conversation, if you want. And one of the last speakers referred just now to other creative parts of our society, of our skill set that we have. The commons. You know, there are some who would argue that the commons are not subject to the tragedy as defined by the failure of governance and rights, but that it is a matter of, you know, in the tradition of Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize economist, of arguing how the commons can be managed. And what Pachauri said is, well, yes, you can choose different models, but for God's sake, get on and do something about it, because the way you're doing it right now, you're doing nothing. And if you simply critique and you cannot evolve a social and economic model on how to make it work, then we'll continue discussing it. Final point, why do we go on with plastic bottles? You know, I think this is where I'm a believer in so many of the examples that, you know, we put in this report called the transition towards a green economy. Because at the end of the day, you can blame this morning's organizers to have plastic bottles here. But, you know, if you're organizing a meeting like this, are you going to worry about getting everybody here? Or are you going to worry about where the drinks are going to come from? This is where we also need to put the kind of incentives and regulatory system in place that either you have jugs of water in all public venues as being the normality, or you have maybe a law that makes sure that bottles are recycled. And I think in Brazil we have a very interesting phenomenon. I'm told that 98% of all drinks containers, the aluminium containers, are recycled. Now, why did that happen? Well, because there was some legislation put in place, there are some economic incentives, people collect these things and they recycle them. Okay, you may say, let's not have them in the first place, but you know, we don't always meet in places where we have a tap of water. So we do need containers. The phones, very interesting example. 1 billion cell phones are now sold every year on the world market. 1 billion. Now, how are we dealing with the recycling of this? There's an extraordinary amount of material that gets thrown away, lies in drawers, or lands up in the landfills of the world. In a country like Africa, they are also part of an e-waste problem now. The problem is the technology to recycle these cell phones is actually very sophisticated, and here technology transfer comes in. So instead of talking, we should be making sure that every African nation, for example, has the technology to recycle cell phones and recuperate all these precious metals, rare earths, plastics, instead of letting them be put on the waste dumps of our planet. What I'm trying to get to is, we have answers of how we can address this issue, from the plastic bottle to the cell phone to renewable energy. And I want to say here, because I often feel as if, you know, there is a perception that we in the United Nations don't do things in the way that we talk about them. We try, and I have a very interesting example in 20 seconds. When we had to build a new building for accommodating the UNEP, because we had to move out of the old one in Nairobi, the question was, were we going to just build another building like it has always been built? Or would we build something that speaks to the, you know, the mission of UNEP, which is cleaner energy, less waste, etc. If you then went into the United Nations regulations on how you could do this, you would have given up, because it starts with the fundamental premise of public procurement. A budget in the UN is you build a building and then it's done. To try and come with the idea of a renewable energy, in this case a photovoltaic infrastructure that you would have to pay 8 years of electricity bills in advance in order to have 15, 20 years then of free electricity afterwards, was irreconcilable with the budget system of the United Nations. And the same is true for virtually every government. So we have to change public procurement, we have to change the laws in our societies that help citizens to not make the alternative of the plastic bottle 10 times more difficult than simply taking one. To use public transport. I mean, moving around Rio in the 21st century is also a failure of urban planning. And this is a city that is suffocating on its own traffic. But is that an impossibility to solve? No, we know nowadays what can be done. But it is the new urban development concepts. They need to be implemented. My point is, we can get angry about the plastic bottle, but go 3 steps further back and ask yourself, how do we make it easier, more viable, and also accessible for citizens to do the right thing, the more intelligent thing, the less destructive thing. Because then they will do it. Nobody wants to have a plastic bottle. If they have an alternative that's better, doesn't cost more, and is actually something that they have access to. This is, I think, where we have to begin to learn the lessons that we have learned in every country. Things can be done. But people just go on talking, because they don't go back to the fundamental root and keep all the symptoms on the focus. So, just a few responses to the questions, and I particularly want to emphasize the global citizens movement is vital, it's fundamental. Without that voice, I can assure you, nothing will really change, because the systems that are there are rooted in the present. Thank you.